I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Weber. Mike is a popular returning speaker for the museum, and he has a long history and love of Cornwall. As a child, he collected rock and mineral specimens from in and around the mine's waste rock piles, and that led him to the study of geology. As a 1982 geoscience graduate from Penn State University, Mike worked for 36 years as a geologist, health physicist, and manager for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Geological Survey. After retiring from federal service, he returned to Cornwall, where he serves as a guide and researches the history of mining and the geology of Cornwall and similar deposits of Pennsylvania. He's also recently added the history of the furnace that he's doing lots and lots of work on. So there will be more in the coming months and years about that as well. So Mike is a weekly volunteer at the museum and gives guided tours of the Cornwall Iron Furnace on most Fridays. He's also the author of Always More Production, a history of mining operation at Cornwall that is now available for sale at the Cornwall Iron Furnace Museum store. So please welcome our speaker, Mike Weber.
Well, good evening. Thanks for that introduction, Mike. I appreciate it. And allow me to add my welcome to those of you who are joining us live here at Cornwall Manor, as well as those of you who are joining us by Zoom. It is my pleasure to present tonight an overview about charcoal, the fuel that forged our nation. And I would like to thank Cornwall Manor for sponsoring this seminar, hosting it tonight. Also to the Cornwall Furnace Associates for sponsoring the presentation. And in particular, I'd like to thank Mike Emery, our acting site administrator. You notice that acting term. That's because Mike is now the Eastern Division Chief for the Bureau of Historic Sites and Museums. So congratulations, Mike. The good news is that a very eligible candidate was selected for the position. The bad news, I guess, for Cornwall is that we may not have Mike for many more years. He'll be the boss of whoever the site administrator is. But just speaking personally, I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with Mike in his current capacity, and I look forward to continuing to work with him and his successor at Cornwall, whoever that may be. I'd also like to thank Kathy Donaldson, who's the treasurer of the Cornwall Furnace Associates, and Bruce Chadbourne, who's in the back there with that nifty Hawaiian shirt on, who's serving as the videographer. And of course, you also know Bruce is a researcher and a writer, and he's a resident of Cornwall Manor. So many titles for that young man. My presentation this evening is actually the second part of a four-part series of presentations that deal with the raw materials that were fed into the Cornwall furnace and one waste product, slag, which was generated by the Cornwall furnace. I presented about slag last year, so if you're interested in viewing that, you can watch it on the Cornwall Furnace YouTube channel. And with that, let's get going. I think I'm getting messages up there on my screen for some reason. Hopefully that won't distract you. So my presentation this evening features charcoal, the fuel that helped Cornwall Furnace to operate for 141 years and also helped to forge our nation. And by the end of the presentation, I hope you have a general understanding about Cornwall, the basics. What is charcoal? Excuse me. Who discovered charcoal and when did they discover it? How has charcoal been used? How did charcoal help forge the nation? And how has it been used in the iron blast furnaces and so on? And I will leave plenty of time at the end of my presentation to listen to your comments and also answer your questions. Now, I've been conducting tours at Cornwall Furnace for the last 5 years. And when I first started, I tried to read up about charcoal because I thought, well, this is very important. It's the fuel that powered this furnace. So I should know a little bit about it so I can answer questions from our guests. Well, lo and behold, I found that the amount of information available on the internet, in books, and in journals was actually quite limited. And so I was surprised by that because, after all, charcoal was such an important fuel here in the American colonies and around the world. And it's been an important fuel for humans for thousands of years. So I set out to conduct research. And tonight I'll share some of the results of that research with you. And also I will place a focus in presenting the information about charcoal pertinent to Cornwall Furnace. There are many different approaches that you could take to cover a topic like this, but for our purposes, and given that it's sponsored by the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, I thought it was most appropriate to really dwell on the connection with Cornwall. So what is charcoal? It's always a good idea to begin a presentation like this by defining the material that we're going to be discussing. Charcoal is the solid residue of wood that has been thermally decomposed at high heat. Now, we sometimes talk about processes like pyrolysis and carbonization, but we'll deal with that a little bit later. If we subject wood to elevated temperatures in the right conditions, we drive off the water vapor and we also drive off the volatile matter in the wood, and we produce charcoal. The wood initially has a composition of about half or 50% carbon, along with 44% oxygen and about 6% hydrogen by weight. Now, the production of the charcoal boosts the carbon content to as high as 92%, and a small amount of mineral ash is still present as a residue. So what are the characteristics of good quality charcoal? Well, good charcoal retains the structure of the wood from which it was prepared. The charcoal should be jet black in color and may exhibit a shiny luster. Good charcoal, I have to get my props here, also makes like a metallic ringing sound when you strike it on a hard surface or you clunk two pieces together. Quality charcoal has a moderate compressive strength. Good charcoal is relatively clean and does not easily soil your fingers. Now, those of you who cook with charcoal probably take issue with that, but I'd remind you that that might not be good quality charcoal. Just saying. Good quality charcoal is a poor conductor of heat and electricity, so it's a good insulator. When combusted, quality charcoal burns without a flame, unlike the wood, again, from which it was prepared. Good charcoal is also relatively stable and non-reactive. And on the table, for those of you in the room tonight, we have various samples of charcoal. And among them, I have some shards of charcoal that I dug out of the soil around the charcoal barn at Cornwall Furnace. So that charcoal is at least 141 years old. And yet some of that charcoal looks as fresh as the day that it was deposited in the soil. And that brings up another property of good quality charcoal, and that is that it's a durable material. And finally, when charcoal is burned to consumption, quality charcoal should only produce a limited amount of ash. Well, these characteristics, oh, I got charcoal on me. Sorry about that. These characteristics lead to the principal attributes of charcoal. Why was it such an attractive fuel for so many thousands of years? First of all, charcoal burns a lot hotter than wood. A charcoal fire can be anywhere from 2,600 to 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit. And in contrast to that, wood fires typically range from about 300 to 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Second, charcoal produces about twice as much heat as the wood that originally it was derived from. So you can get a lot more heat on a weight basis out of charcoal than you can out of wood. Charcoal burns cleaner and also faster than coal burns. Next, Although moisture content varies somewhat, charcoal generally has a low moisture content. Charcoal weighs about 1/3 as much of the original wood, and its volume is about 1/2 the original volume of the wood. And that means that transporting the charcoal is easier than hauling an equivalent amount of wood. Some limitations of charcoal among these attributes is that charcoal is a friable material. That means it has a tendency to break down if it's being abraded or worn. So normal handling of charcoal, like shoveling it or dropping a bag of charcoal on the ground, can easily reduce 5 to 10% of that charcoal and turn that into fine powder. And in a similar way, the moderate compressive strength of charcoal had limitations on the size of the furnaces that could use the charcoal as the fuel. So if you take a piece of wood and you burn it in the air, the wood has plenty of oxygen to support the combustion of that wood. And so the wood burns and produces ash. But if you take the same piece of wood and you expose it to high temperatures in an oxygen-poor environment, you produce charcoal from the charring of the wood. And that means that the wood has been converted into charcoal. We can illustrate this with a simplified graph about what is occurring during the charring process. So weight loss on this graph is charted on the vertical axis, and temperature in degrees centigrade is charted on the horizontal axis. As the wood is exposed to the elevated temperatures during that first phase on the left, the drying phase, water vapor is driven out of the wood. And above the boiling point of water, this drying out is accelerated along with the release of volatile constituents that are present in the wood. And so you see that rapid decline in the weight of the wood during that part of the phase. This rapid thermal decomposition of wood in an oxygen-poor environment is called pyrolysis. And what's happening during pyrolysis is that the heat breaks down the structural components of the wood. You've heard cellulose, there's hemicellulose, there's lignin. So the heat is breaking down those compounds, and it's also releasing the volatile compounds. So you have carbon monoxide being released, hydrogen, methane, methanol, acetic acid, and pyrolysis oils and tars. Above 270 degrees centigrade or 520 degrees Fahrenheit, the charring reaction or the carbonization becomes self-sustaining. So the curve flattens out above that temperature as the weight loss rate slows down. And once charring has been completed, most of what remains in the charcoal is relatively pure carbon and small amounts of residual mineral ash. There are a variety of factors that affect the rate and extent of this charring. The factors include the type of hearth in which the charring is occurring, the type and the quality of the wood, the size of the wood, and its moisture content. If the charring is occurring in an outside environment, an external environment, the ground conditions around the hearth that is charring may also affect the charring, such as, is the soil beneath the hearth dry? Is it level? Is it solid? And is it relatively free of drafts? Other external environmental factors include the time of year that the charring is occurring in and weather conditions. In addition, because some of the oxygen is needed to sustain a little bit of a burn to maintain the elevated temperature to support the charring, the availability of oxygen for the hearth is also important in controlling the rate and extent of charring. With all these variables, it's easy to see why the men who produced the charcoal, the colliers, required a high level of skill to make this charring in a reliable and productive way, and also minimize the amounts of fires and hazardous conditions, especially when you consider that they did not have the modern measurement capabilities that we have to control variables like moisture content and temperature and oxygen levels. I've mentioned type of wood several times, and that's an important variable in the charring process. Now, guests who frequently come to the Cornwall Furnace often ask whether the furnace workers preferred a particular kind of wood over another. And the short answer to that question is yes, they did. The iron industry generally preferred charcoal that had a high crushing strength. To produce such charcoal required hardwoods and wood that was in good condition before it was charred. And these woods include woods like hickory, oak, and maple. I've listed on the slide the results of an experiment conducted in 1854, comparing charcoal yields from various wood types. And in this case, chestnut, oak, walnut, and pine. The yields were used as a surrogate indicator of the crushing strength of the charcoal. The colliers and the furnace workers also preferred wood that was in good condition. So they attempted to minimize the inclusion of bark, roots, knots, and rotten or flooded wood. From a practical perspective, however, some furnace workers actually preferred a mix of hardwood and softwoods because those charcoals would burn more predictably in the furnace than if you were running day after day using hardwood charcoal and then all of a sudden you had several loads of softwoods. You'd have to compensate for that by how much charcoal you were putting in the furnace and how you charged the furnace. We don't know who discovered charcoal and when they discovered it. Although we do know that ancient humans used charcoal as a source of heat for warmth and for cooking. We can speculate how early humans may have discovered charcoal from lightning or from wood fires. We do know that ancient humans made cave paintings using charcoal, and these charcoals have been age dated to over 30,000 years. So charcoal has been with humanity for a long time. Egyptians documented using charcoal both for metalworking and also for absorbing odors. Ancient Hindus and Phoenicians used charcoal to help purify water. Romans and ancient Israelites used charcoal in refining metals, and the Chinese were the first people to use charcoal along with limestone that enabled them in their furnaces to cast iron about 3,000 years ago. The smelting technology made its way around the globe, arriving in Scandinavia about 1,000 years ago, and that evolved in the technology that today is manifest in the Cornwall Furnace, as well as other iron furnaces that operated in 17th to the 19th century in America. Besides wood, charcoal was the primary fuel for heating and cooking during European colonization. Europeans brought the technology with them to both produce and use charcoal productively as they immigrated into America. The coal iron industry began in America in 1620 at Falling Creek, about 80 miles west of Jamestown, Virginia. And that's close to present-day Appomattox, if you're familiar with Virginia geography. What they did there was both produce charcoal and then use that charcoal in an early iron furnace that operated there. Cold blast iron furnaces were the single biggest consumer of charcoal in Pennsylvania in the 18th and 19th centuries. And production of charcoal iron was the most important manufacturing interest during this period. The photo on the left of this slide shows charcoal that's part of the Cornwall collection, and that dates back to the 19th century, similar to our charcoal shards that are on the table in front of you, although a little smaller. In addition to serving as the primary fuel for iron furnaces in Pennsylvania from 1720 until 1854, charcoal also fueled the finery and chafery forges that were used to subsequently process the iron, as well as the hearths of blacksmiths that used the metal well into the 19th century. Charcoal was also used as the principal fuel for working and refining other metals, including gold and copper, as well as for making glass. Charcoal is a principal ingredient, along with saltpeter and sulfur, in making gunpowder, which was an essential material for the colonists in both hunting and blasting. Charcoal, of course, today is used in fireworks, as it was many, many years ago. Charcoal was burned as a fuel for roasting iron and other materials to remove sulfur and pre-treat iron ore before it was fed into the furnaces. That was a practice done here in Cornwall from the late 1700s into the early 1900s. Of course, charcoal has also been used for thousands of years to purify water through absorption and to remove odors from the air. A single pound of crushed charcoal, get this, is sufficient to absorb all the odors that are inhaled in an average human lifetime. A single pound. That's a lot of odors. It's used in horticulture to absorb chemicals. Charcoal continues to be used in the United States as a fuel for cooking and abroad for cooking and heating. Charcoal has been used in making ink, treating upset stomachs, removing poisons once they've been ingested, and even in brushing teeth, as you see in this photo. A small amount of charcoal is used for art. As we will discuss later, charcoal is also a byproduct of the wood distillation process. So the bottom line is charcoal is quite useful and versatile. Now, given this utility and versatility, it is not surprising that humans have been producing charcoal for thousands of years. The methods of production have evolved over time, and they progressively have become more efficient. The least efficient method of producing charcoal was a wood fire. While most of the wood is consumed in an oxygen-rich environment, burned up to ash, a small fraction of that wood is actually charred and may remain behind as charcoal. People learned that they could boost the amount of charcoal produced by building a fire in a pit and then smothering that fire with soil by placing it on top. These forest hearths or pits evolved into what we call today meilers. And those meilers were a more efficient technique to produce a greater fraction of the wood to convert it into charcoal. And then the meilers evolved into kilns and retorts. And I'll talk about each of these over the next series of slides. So let's take a look at meilers. Meilers have been used to produce charcoal since the Middle Ages. Meilers are still used today in parts of Africa, South America, and in Asia to make charcoal. The diagram you see is a typical cross-section of a meiler. Pieces of wood up to about 4 feet in length are stacked around a central chimney, and then smaller pieces and branches of wood are placed on the sides of the larger pieces of wood and on the top. And once the wood was in place, the meilers are then covered with soil, leaves, sod, moss, and charcoal dust. Anything to restrict the flow of air into the meiler and insulate the pit. Meilers that were used in Pennsylvania were typically 30 to 50 feet in diameter and 15 to 20 feet high. That size meiler could be used to char 25 to 50 cords of wood and produce 20 to 40 bushels of charcoal per cord. This sequence of photographs shows the construction of a typical, although smaller scale meiler. The photo in the upper left shows the initial stacking of wood around that central chimney. The photo in the middle of the slide shows a completed pit before the soil and leaves are placed on the top and sides of the meiler. In the lower right, the soil and leaves are now in place, and the charring process or burn has started by placing embers down that central chimney and then covering the chimney to restrict the flow of air into the pit. As the charring progressed, the colliers had to tend the meilers both day and night to make sure and guard against fires and ensure that there was even progress in the charring of the wood in the pits. If the pile got too hot and flames erupted, then the colliers placed more soil on the pile to suppress the fire. If the charring slowed down too much, then the colliers placed holes in the soil and the leaves to allow more air to get into the pits. Here in Pennsylvania, meilers were typically used to produce charcoal from March until late October. Now, some years, depending on weather conditions, you could start charcoal production a little bit earlier or progress it later into the year, but most years the charring occurred between late spring and early fall. In the engraving you see on the top of this picture, the French author Diderot described these steps in the encyclopedia he published in 1765. So you can see that the technology remained relatively stable throughout hundreds of years. Now, here's my plug for our friends at Hopewell. If you are interested in observing charcoal production today using meilers, volunteers at the Hopewell Furnace conduct charcoal burns each May and August. The photos in this slide are from the Hopewell burn that occurred in August of 2023. And on the table in that cardboard box, the larger box, are pieces of charcoal that were made in the August 2024 burn that recently was concluded. So we appreciate those samples so you can look at them. If you pick them up, you'll feel that there's a little bit of sand in there, and you can it's just awesome to be able to sense that charcoal. The burn had just commenced in the photo on the left. Unlike a full-size meiler, these meilers are a little bit smaller with typically 5 to 7 cords of wood and a pit height of maybe 6 to 8 feet high. The photo on the right shows the meiler as it neared the end of its burn about 2 weeks later. The meiler is now about 1/3 of its original size and about 3 feet tall. And the woman with the shovel you see in that photo is controlling the burn by placing soil on hot spots on the pile. If you're interested in observing this firsthand, or better yet, volunteering, they always need people on the night shift to watch these pits. You can find out more information about the Hopewell burns on the Hopewell Furnace website. And we also have a representative here tonight. So if you're interested, talk to him, because I'm sure he'd love to get your contact information and sign you up. So how much time does it take, an effort, to actually produce, build, char, and remove the charcoal from these meilers? Well, this slide breaks down the process in terms of time, assuming the work is performed by a single individual. Preparing the hearth lasted anywhere from 1 to 5 days. This would involve leveling the surface on which the meiler was constructed, removing rocks and roots and other obstructions. Now, of course, more time was required the first time an area was used for a charcoal hearth. If you reuse the same area, less time would be required because you've already broken in that area. Next, setting and stacking the wood, in this case about 35 cords, would take about 2 days. This work was typically done by the timbermen or the forestmen who had brought the cut wood to support the charcoal production, not by the colliers or the colliers' helpers. Now, of course, when they were done stacking the wood, then the colliers would make any adjustments before covering those piles with soil and with leaves as part of that process. And that covering typically took about 2 days. Once the pile was covered and it was lit, it would take anywhere from 12 to 20 days, again, depending on conditions. And after the charring was complete, the meilers would allow the charcoal to cool for up to a week sometimes, drawing enough charcoal after it's cooled from the top of the piles and placing it in wagons and carts as they arrived to transport that charcoal back to the furnaces that they were supporting. Now, they had to ensure that the charcoal was sufficiently cooled down before loading the wagons, or else they ran the risk that the charcoal would ignite. That's not a good situation. In addition, once the charcoal was exposed to air, it would absorb moisture. And under the right conditions, that absorption of moisture can cause spontaneous combustion of charcoal. Again, not a good situation. So colliers and the teamsters hauling the material would have to remain vigilant while both drawing and hauling the charcoal. The total time for this multiple step process, as you can see in the slide, is 21 to 37 days. Colliers and timbermen would construct and char multiple meilers at a time to boost the production. A typical efficiency for a meiler was anywhere from 15 to 25%. That means that for every 100 pounds of wood placed in the meiler pit, you would get 15 to 25 pounds of charcoal out of that pit if you did it right. This efficiency, while being rather low, was sufficient to produce enough charcoal to meet the local needs. Almost all the charcoal that fueled Cornwall Furnace for the 141 years that it operated was produced using meilers. Wood and charcoal were produced on land that was owned by the ironmaster, as well as on land that was owned privately on property adjacent to the furnace tracks. This slide shows a map of Lebanon County. Cornwall Furnace is located at the Blue Star. The city of Lebanon is that irregular polygon in the center of the lower third of the county north of Cornwall. The red circles represent the locations where wood was harvested in 1768 and 1769 to make the charcoal. And the green circles represent wood that was harvested in 1776 to 1798. I matched place names recorded in the coal and cordwood books for Cornwall with the original land warrants and patents in the county. And thanks to Lebanon County Historical Society for making that information available to me. The records also show that some areas of forested land were reharvested over 20 and 30 years of regrowth. You can see from this map how extensive the charcoal production was to support Cornwall Furnace. And I'd remind you, this is only a small fraction of the wood and charcoal produced that supported the furnace for 141 years. More extensive analysis shows that wood was harvested from as far west as Round Top and Hummelstown, as far east as Kikalico, Fredericksburg to the north, and Brickerville to the south. No wonder these hills were given the name Furnace Hills in the 18th century. Before we leave the topic of meilers, it's fitting to pay tribute to the men who made the charcoal, the colliers. What were their lives like? Men like Joseph Johns in the Lebanon Valley, Lafayette Haupt at Hopewell, and David Moody at Sugarloaf Mountain near Frederick, Maryland. While making charcoal, colliers and their helpers had to tend up to 10 pits at a time, working around the clock, like we've already alluded to produce charcoal and make certain that the wood piles did not burn. They typically worked 5 days in a row, and then they took turns over the weekends going home to visit with their families and houses, but only staying long enough to take up new provisions and return to the forest, because most times they were doing this on foot. Their skill level was determined by how thoroughly they charred the wood in their pits, and how much uncharred wood or brands remained at the end of the burn. Their pay was generally good, up to $1,500 based on skill level in the mid-1800s for the entire charring season. Most colliers were paid based on quality and amount of charcoal. So, for example, in the 18th century, typical rates of payment were 10 shillings per 100 bushels of charcoal. That's a lot of work for 10 shillings. Within hours of the job, of course, the colliers were covered with black soot and with charcoal dust, and went days without washing or changing their clothes. They lived in primitive conical huts, about 8 feet in diameter, 10 feet high, close to the pits that they were tending. They ate salted pork and bread and potatoes, onions, beans, coffee, and molasses. And occasionally during the fall months, they might get a little apple butter as a treat. At the end of the season, they would return home and winter with their families or at their houses. And many of the colliers were farmers, so they made the charcoal to supplement the family income and help make means. The work was long, tedious, and hazardous, but the colliers played a vital role in supporting the yarn industry, and large-scale charcoal production began to shift from meilers to kilns. The kilns operated like the meilers, except that they used fixed, rigid structures that were constructed out of stone, bricks, and plate iron and steel. Very and more even charring of the wood. The capacities of the kilns were generally larger than the meilers, with up to 75 cords or more. The kilns achieved higher conversion efficiencies of 35 to 45% or 40 to 60 bushels of charcoal per cord of wood. Even Cornwall Furnace operated 2 rectangular kilns in the 1880s. First-person observations of this, we have no idea where those kilns were located on site today and when they were constructed. Now, as with most technological innovations, there were many charcoal furnace operators who would outpace the capacity of meilers for charcoal production. Meilers were more conveniently located. They were close to the wood that was being harvested, whereas the kilns were typically located closer to the furnaces that they supported. This meant that the wood had to be hauled to the kilns from the forest. And of course, that wood was a lot heavier than the much lighter and more compact charcoal that could be shipped from the meilers to the furnaces. Meilers required lower capital costs than the kilns. However, once the kilns were constructed, they could be reused over and over again, whereas each time the meiler to be built, so that was time and effort, only more uniform and of a higher quality than that produced in the meilers. Less soil, rocks, and debris were typically found in the charcoal made in the kilns. And finally, although the meilers could only operate from March until October most years, the kilns could produce charcoal throughout the year, including during the winter months. The photo on the right of this slide is of the beehive kilns from Wassaic, New York in the late 19th century. And by the 1880s, kilns were becoming more popular to produce charcoal in Pennsylvania. Soon after kilns gained widespread acceptance in the charcoal community, retorts were introduced as the next step in the continued evolution of the charcoal technology in the 1880s. With a retort, the primary product are distillates of the gases that are driven out of the thermally decomposed wood inside metal tanks and containers. The charcoal that's produced in the retorts is actually a byproduct. They're not principally after producing charcoal. They want the gases and the distillates that come out of the retorts. The ranges in size of the retorts was from less than 20 cords to more than 200 cords. Wood in tanks were generally heated externally by burning the tar that had been distilled from earlier retort action. The distillates were collected and processed to recover materials like acetic acid, acetone, methanol, turpentine, and other products. The wood distillation industry produced most of the commercial industrial products in this country from the 1880s until the 1920s, when they were displaced by the petrochemical industry. Transportation also played a significant role in the delivery of charcoal to the furnaces. Soon after charcoal furnaces began operating, of course, the wood surrounding the furnace would be quickly stripped, and so the charcoal had to be transported greater and greater distances. The transportation cost for the charcoal was often the most significant cost component for charcoal delivered to the furnaces. Sleds were used to transport the wood to the meilers or to the kilns, and then horse or mule or oxen-driven wagons and carts were used to transport the charcoal to the furnaces. The photo on this slide shows a typical horse-drawn wagon that carried charcoal in Massachusetts. Similar wagons were used at Cornwall and at Hopewell Furnaces to haul between 100 and 300 bushels of charcoal at a time. And they were generally 20 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet high. Charcoal could be dumped quickly by removing a side plate or a bottom plate. And this was important in case the charcoal caught fire while it was in transit. Otherwise, they might lose both the wagon and the livestock that were transporting the charcoal. Such features also help to reduce the handling of the charcoal. And that, remember, with the handling of the charcoal, it decreased the size of the charcoal quickly. In some cases, the charcoal would break down as much as a quarter, 26%, with a short transport over the rough roads that existed at the time. So typical distances to haul the charcoal away from the furnace ranged from 4 to 7 miles. Now, at Cornwall Furnace, the workers preferred charcoal that ranged from 4 to 12 inches in length. If the charcoal got too small, it would clog the furnace and interrupt the blast, and that was not good for the operation of the furnace. So this limited wagon transport of charcoal over rough roads at the time to about 12 miles or so. And by the 1850s, railroads also began transporting charcoal to the furnaces. And by the 1860s, for example, the Isabella Furnace in Chester County, Pennsylvania, was receiving by rail charcoal that was being produced 300 miles away in northwestern Pennsylvania. 300 miles versus 12 miles. The Pennsylvania Railroad and other railroads built cars that were specifically designed to safely transport the charcoal. Just like the wagons that preceded them, these rail cars had to be designed properly and carefully operated to avoid fires and also to reduce the reduction of the size of the charcoal during handling. Studies of rail transport at the time showed that charcoal volume reductions up to 16% due to the abrasion during transit and packing of the charcoal. Now, we haven't specifically talked about how did they measure charcoal, but this is an important component because a variety of units existed to measure the charcoal, and measuring the charcoal was important because charcoal was the most expensive component in supporting the furnace operations. So a little change in the unit amount of charcoal being consumed could have a big impact on the bottom line of the operation of the furnaces. Measuring cords of wood before it was converted to charcoal was not good because of the range and variability in the conversion ratios between wood and charcoal. Bushels eventually became the preferred means to measure after state legislatures standardized the unit volumes and weights of the bushels. And that was at the urging of groups like the U.S. Association of Charcoal Iron Workers. In the 1830s, the size of a bushel of charcoal varied from 2150 to 2844 cubic inches. Or to put that in SI units, that's 35 to 47 liters. Most states eventually agreed on a standard volume and weight for bushels by the 1880s of 40 liters or 2478 cubic inches, or about 20 pounds of charcoal. Charcoal loads delivered to the furnaces weren't preferred because they varied based on the size and capacity of the carts and wagons that were being used to transport the charcoal. And a simple weight measure such as ton was not preferred for charcoal because increased moisture content, impurities in the charcoal, and also brands added weight to the charcoal, but reduced the fuel value of that charcoal. So just how much charcoal was used in the furnaces? Well, the amount of charcoal consumed in the furnace varied based on wood type, moisture content, iron production rates, blast rates, ore grade, hearth construction, and other factors. Cornwall Furnace produced 3 to 4 tons of iron every day during its 141 years of operation when the furnace was in blast. Although the number and size of the charges varied, about 30 charges or half charges a day, with about 20 bushels of charcoal per charge, are reasonable values to take for the operation of Cornwall Furnace. About 200 bushels of charcoal were required to make a ton of cast iron, as reported in the litigation involved in Alden's appeal in 1880 here at Cornwall. This means that Cornwall Furnace consumed about an acre worth of trees converted to charcoal every day that the furnace was in blast. So you get a good appreciation for how important charcoal was in supporting the operation of the furnaces. And Cornwall was only one of hundreds of charcoal furnaces that operated in the state of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania was a leader in the charcoal iron production. So with thousands of charcoal furnaces across the United States in the 19th century, tens of millions of bushels of charcoal were consumed annually to make iron using the charcoal for our nation. In 1879, for example, over 54 million bushels of charcoal were consumed, and that represented about 1.8 million cords of wood to produce about 360,000 tons of pig iron. Annual production of charcoal peaked in 1882 in the United States at 107 million bushels of charcoal. And that's because after that period, mineral coal and coke became the dominant fuels. The large demand for wood to produce charcoal drove the iron masters and furnaces to acquire more forest land to build up the plantations. Many furnaces closed prematurely because they could not get enough wood to sustain the operation of the furnaces. A typical coal blast furnace required on the order of 300 acres of forested land to produce enough charcoal to keep the furnace in blast for a year. So if the furnace operated for, say, 20 years, and they were relying on wood that they were getting only from their plantation, that plantation would have to be at least 6,000 acres to support that operation over the period. You can see this in the examples that I cite here on this slide, including Cornwall, Elizabeth, and Hopewell Furnace, each of which had plantations that grew to about 10,000 acres. And I'd remind you that at Cornwall Furnace, they had acquired a significant amount of wood and charcoal on private lands in addition to those lands that they owned. And this helps explain how furnaces like the Warwick Furnace, that you can see down towards the bottom of that chart, could operate on a plantation of only 1,800 acres. They had to be buying charcoal from off their plantation. At the bottom of the slide, I reiterate the wood consumption rates reported for the Cornwall Furnace in that litigation back in the 1800s. Eventually, charcoal was displaced as the preferred fuel for iron furnaces in the United States. Most charcoal furnaces had closed in Pennsylvania by 1880. Cornwall Furnace went out of blast for the last time on February 11th, 1883. And that closure was forced by a variety of factors, including the increasing cost of producing the charcoal, the greater competition and efficiency of modern hot blast furnaces that burned mineral coal and coke, foreign competition of iron production, and reduced profits for the operation. When Cornwall closed in its final years, the pig iron that it had been producing cost about twice as much as it did in the hot blast furnaces that were operating right here in Cornwall, as well as nearby in Lebanon. The last of the Pennsylvania charcoal iron furnaces, the Eagle Furnace in Curtin, closed in 1921. In the chart on the right side, you can see the blue dashed line that depicts the decline in the percentage of charcoal iron in the United States from the 1830s until the 1890s. Even though the largest demand for charcoal had evaporated with the closure of the furnaces, farmers and timbermen continued to make charcoal to support their needs. So that brings us to where we are today. About 800,000 tons of charcoal are produced each year in the United States, and most of that production is in poured concrete kilns as well as continuous furnaces. In addition to wood, charcoal today is made of other materials, including bark, edgings, sawdust, pits from stone fruits, and other biological materials. Charcoal is used today in the United States not just for cooking, but also for the production of ferrosilicate, filtration, absorption, and horticultural purposes. Global markets for charcoal are much larger than they are here in the United States. In 2000, global consumption of charcoal exceeded 21 million metric tons for cooking and heating, as well as for other uses. Charcoal today is consumed in chunks like we had on the table, also in briquettes and in logs. And in the briquettes and the logs, the charcoal chunks are pulverized, and then they're blended with a binder agent like starch, and then other materials are added, including limestone, clay, coal, charred lignite, and agricultural residues. And on the internet today, you can still find abundant information about specialty charcoals and cooking techniques using charcoal. And that suggests to me that charcoal will continue to fuel at least a small portion of our society's fuel needs for years to come. So we've covered a lot of territory tonight in this overview of charcoal, the fuel that forged our nation. I hope that you leave tonight knowing a little bit more about charcoal than perhaps you did when you first arrived. I want to thank you for your attention. And in addition, I thank Cornwall Manor for hosting our seminar this evening, for the Cornwall Furnace Associates for sponsoring the presentation, and to Mike Emery, the Division Chief of the Eastern Division of the Bureau of Historic Sites and Museums, to Kathy Donaldson in the back there who organized our webinar, and to Bruce Chadbourne, our videographer, researcher, writer, and resident of Cornwall Manor. And now I'd be happy to answer your questions and listen to your comments. Thanks. You want to start with questions in the room, Mike? Or you... Okay. Yes.
How much did that rainstorm back then?
The Meiler? Yeah. So depending on how it was constructed and just how bad the rainstorm was, it could have a big impact on the Meiler. Our Hopewell colleague back there has firsthand experience, so you know what happens when you have downpours in August and May. But the reports in the literature suggest that a heavy downpour could put out the burn, or worse yet, it could expose the wood, and then the wood would burn and you would lose the contents. Just the other day, I was looking at records from 1758, and one of the local farmers complained that during a big storm, it blew the cover off the Meiler and the wood burned with large flames. So,
Structure or roof over it to help prevent that?
Yeah. So the question was, did anybody try to build a structure or roof over a Meiler to try to prevent that? And the answer is yes. And that's what evolved into the kilns that they eventually relied on, because that was a fixed structure that would protect the wood. And not all kilns were successful. I know at Hopewell, they tried a kiln and it didn't work so well. I think there was leakage in the mortar. And if you got too much air in, the wood would burn, not char. So other questions? Yes, sir.
My daughter is a collier at Hopewell.
Wow.
Has been for several years. And I kind of wonder, what in the world is the attraction of being a collier? It looks like it's slave labor.
So the question is, what's the attraction of being a collier when it looks like it's heavy duty? It's a big job. I think it goes back to many of the early crafts, right? A lot of skill is required to properly burn a Meiler pit and to produce as much charcoal. So it's a little bit of a game to try to figure out if you can build it the right way and you can cover it the right way, that you can char it the right way and get the most out of it. When you build that meiler, you're not sure how much charcoal you're going to get out of that pit. And that is the challenge associated with being a meiler. I don't know if you want to add to that back there. Yes.
I can tell you that.
You want to come up to the mic? Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rick Rouse. I'm one of the Hopewell colliers, and I think I know your daughter. I know at Hopewell, I've been doing it for 25 years, and we have about 25 volunteers who make the charcoal. And a big part of it is just the camaraderie between all of us and the fun that we have. It is challenging sometimes, depending on the weather. We've had weeks of rain, which does not oftentimes do good for the piles. But why would they do it? The challenge, like Mike said, and they made good money. It was a pretty good job at the time. Thanks.
I think we had a lady in the pink back there.
They have some kind of reforestation program back then.
Aha,
I mean, all that land, using all those trees just for one day.
right. So the question is, did they have a reforestation program back then? And the answer to that is yes, kind of. So the ironmasters who were acquiring the property with the intent not just to harvest a single harvest, but to go back and repeatedly harvest, did practice early forestry if they intended to continue to operate for an extended period of time. What they would often do is coppice the trees. And with a coppice, you cut it off maybe 3 to 4 feet above the ground surface, but you leave the roots intact. And what will happen in most cases, unless the cows nibble off the new shoots, is the tree will go back. And in 20 to 30 years, you can come back and now harvest smaller diameter wood that grew out of that original trunk. And so they would do that repeatedly, and that allowed them to harvest 4 or 5 times over the lifetime of some of these furnaces. So, yes, did you have?
She pretty much asked my question, but let me ask a related question. Wouldn't the cost increase over time if you had to keep bringing wood in from farther and farther away?
Yes.
Almost to a point where you have to go out of business because now you're increasing your transportation costs.
Right. So the question is, wouldn't your cost for the charcoal go up over time if you had to bring it in from greater and greater distances? And the answer to that question is yes. And that's why a smart ironmaster would not only grow his own wood, but also work with local neighbors to, if somebody wanted to clear their land for agricultural purposes, what a deal. Hey, I'll take your wood from you, or I'll, in fact, cut it down and I'll take it off your property. So there were ways that smart businessmen could operate these furnaces and control their costs. But like I said, a lot of furnaces went out of business because they could not sustain their charcoal operation. Bruce, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah. A little bit about Governor Dick.
Maybe Mike can cover Governor Dick. The reason I say that is because I'm still doing research, and at least with what I may as well say it. With what I'm seeing, I'm starting to question just how much wood and charcoal did Governor Dick produce. So there's more research that has to be done. For those of you who may not be aware, Governor Dick is an enslaved individual who worked here for the Cornwall Furnace back in the 1700s. There is a hill named in his honor right next to Mount Gretna, and there's an observation tower on top of that hill. The story that we often tell is that Governor Dick was an industrious enslaved African American who produced a large amount of wood and also charcoal in support of the Cornwall Furnace. Why I'm now having questions about that is because in the time books that were kept for the furnace, I'm not finding that Governor Dick was the one who was cutting the wood and producing the charcoal. I'm finding a Dick Jr. who was doing a lot of that work. But Dick Jr. never received the title governor. So more to come on that. Maybe we'll have another seminar someday on the real Governor Dick. But is that what you were looking for?
Yeah. Please.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Are there competing applications that would use charcoal also, like lime kilns and stuff?
Yes, there are. So the question is, are there competing uses for charcoal? And would that have caused some competition for the charcoal production? The answer is yes. Not only for the use in producing lime, which of course was quite abundant here in the Lebanon Valley, Lancaster County, Berks County, but also for making gunpowder. During the Revolutionary War, gunpowder was in short supply, so there was a diversion of the charcoal stream into gunpowder production. And of course, these other uses of charcoal also competed. Horticultural uses of charcoal would affect the market for modern day production of charcoal. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
What's the price of coal compared to charcoal today?
So the question is, how does the price of coal compare to charcoal today? Well, coal's a lot less expensive than charcoal. You can buy charcoal today in a hardware store. I do it. That's where some of this charcoal came from. And a 20-pound bag might cost you about $30. Coal is a lot less expensive than that, depending on where you are and what kind of coal you're buying. But that's what ultimately priced out. Plus, as I mentioned, the mineral coal fueled furnaces, that's a mouthful, were also more modern than the charcoal furnaces. So not only were they burning a different fuel, but they were also burning that fuel more efficiently than the older charcoal furnaces were. And that contributed to the demise of the charcoal iron industry.
It's true that the charcoal in iron ore is by charcoal.
The question was, wasn't it true that the iron produced using charcoal was a purer iron than the charcoal produced with coal? That was what the charcoal iron workers would tell you. And a lot of this existed before the invention of the modern field of metallurgy. But as metallurgy came into its own, beginning in about the 1860s, 1870s, there was a lot of research done to compare and contrast iron made from mineral fuels and iron made from charcoal. And even during the Civil War, Dahlgren, who was a famous man in the Navy, produced a lot of weapons for the Union, preferred cold blast charcoal fueled iron. So he was quite intent on buying iron that had originated at Cornwall. But later, that series of testing that occurred as metallurgy came into its own showed that no, there is no practical difference between charcoal iron and mineral coal iron. It really has more to do with how the metal is cast and how it is treated after it's out of the furnace. So for years, the charcoal iron industry kept itself in business by promoting these themes that it is a better iron. But ultimately, with metallurgy, it proved no, that's not the case. So good question. One of the reasons why the Eagle furnace continued to operate in Curtin was because they were able to make a big deal about the preference for charcoal iron over coal iron. And that worked for a while. And then they had a big fire in 1921. And that was when the bottom dropped out of their market. It's because people found other sources of the iron. Okay, questions online, Mike?
Right. Our first question online is, with so many acres of trees needed, how much of South Central Pennsylvania was bald? And did any areas of Lebanon or Lancaster retain any old growth forest?
Yeah. So the question is, with all that demand for charcoal, how much of southeastern Pennsylvania was bald?
Yeah.
And then, are there any old growth forests that remain? And the answer to the first part of that question is most of southeastern Pennsylvania was stripped of trees. And that's not just southeast Pennsylvania, that's the entire Commonwealth. I've seen estimates that around the turn of the 20th century, about 3% of Pennsylvania still was forested, which boggles my mind because you drive today across the Commonwealth and you just see all those trees. And growing up in a forested area, I always thought, oh, Pennsylvania was blessed with all this timber. And indeed we are. But because of the heavy demands placed on that timber, much of that timber was cut. And that's what in part prompted the conservation movement under Theodore Roosevelt and under Governor Pinchot and other conservationists. And they ultimately led to a change in societal's view about the need for forested land. Now, the second part of that was, are there old growth forests that remained
In this area?
in this area? I'm not aware of any old growth forests in this area. There might be a few trees here and there, but not an entire forest. And even up and down the Atlantic seaboard, there's not a lot of old growth forest that remains. Are you aware of any?
Curtis, what's the state park up north that has old growth forest? Is it Oak Forest?
The Allegheny National Forest has.
Does it? Somebody said the Allegheny National Forest has some old growth
Virgin, they call it.
virgin timber. So, but not much.
Cook Forest is.
Cook Forest. Oh, thanks. Other questions?
Okay, one other question that I have open. Is there a bit of an analogy between anthracite coal versus bituminous coal and high quality charcoal versus lower quality charcoal?
So the question is there an analogy between anthracite coal and bituminous coal and high quality charcoal and low quality charcoal? I'd have to think about that. Anthracite coal, of course, is a more dense metamorphosed coal. Was the coal that was produced from the Schuylkill Valley and here around Pottstown and all up in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania. But it was really the bituminous coals that led the revolution to produce coke from the coal. And that coke became a predominant fuel for the furnaces here in Pennsylvania and indeed throughout much of the world before modern technologies took over. So that's it. Other questions here in the room? Yes, sir.
Heard stories about colliers climbing on top. It's horrible. They would climb on top, jumping the boundary.
Yeah, so the question is, we've heard stories about the colliers having to go up on top of the meilers, on top of the pits to stomp on them. Are there records about how many colliers died? The first part of that is true. That's a technique called jumping the pit. And what the colliers were doing was ensuring that the pit remained fairly uniformly compacted, so that would promote a more even charring of the wood in the pit throughout that life cycle of the charring. And yes, it was dangerous because if it wasn't done the right way, or if conditions were just not supportive, the collier could fall into the burning pit, and you would have potentially a big flamed death of the collier. So we know of colliers that died from that, but I don't have any numbers on. Rick, do
We've heard
you want to use the mic?
We've heard that when colliers actually jumped the pile, they would go up with a shovel held sideways so that if they did fall in, it would be able to support them to be able to get out rather than fall through the whole pile. And we actually have a photograph of a collier doing that, standing on the top and jumping on the pile with the shovel handle supporting himself in case he fell into the pile. So yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And it was dangerous.
Yeah, it's hazardous work. Other questions? Yes, Bruce.
You had an intern at the Historical Society found that a lot of the
Yeah. So Bruce Bomberger from the Lebanon County Historical Society said that we had an intern at the society that did work and found that a lot of the colliers and collier helpers were coming into the country store to buy shoes, perhaps more frequently than their non-collier colleagues were, justifiably. Okay.
Another wonderful presentation, Mike. Thank you very much. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Mike Weber for his presentation, and for Kathy Donaldson and Bruce Chadbourne for helping to organize our virtual talk. I also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored this program, and of course, Cornwall Manor for allowing us to use this space. This will be our last lecture for 2024, but join us for our next event, Christmas at Cornwall, on Saturday, December 7th. Of course, a reminder, the museum is open Friday through Sunday for tours, so please check our website for details and tour information. And also, if you'd like to go ahead and make a donation to keep the programs going, we're working on putting programs together for 2025. There is a basket in the back. Bruce, who is wearing his official basket shirt, Hawaiian shirt back there, will be taking donations. So thank you, everyone, for coming out, and please stay safe and good night.